The government is keeping something from you. A hidden agenda. But why? Is it political? Have the government dropped the ball with the economy and they're trying to cover it up? Are the death rates and infection rates being exaggerated to cause fear and panic? Today I'm going to be analysing the current infection rates and death rates behind Covid-19 and comparing them to other causes of death around the world to try and determine why the UK and the US and other countries have reacted in such a way to figure out once and for all if there's a hidden agenda. But before I get any further into the video, I do want to say that I don't mean any disrespect to anyone at all. I'm not saying that we should simply ignore it and let people pass away, or that it's fake news and doesn't exist, because I'm sure pretty much everyone watching this video knows someone either directly or indirectly that's been affected by Covid-19. Firstly, I also don't want to sound like some crazy conspiracy theorist, like, oh, the government is run by aliens, or the moon landing was faked, or the government are hiding the cure for cancer. So let's look at the facts. Back in April time in the UK there was around 4,000 to 6,000 cases a day, which was met by around 300 to 1,000 deaths every single day, which is about a 10% death rate. But it's fairly well documented that the death rate for Covid-19 is nowhere near 10%, and it's much more reasonably somewhere between 1 and 3%. The UK figures are being overinflated, which is stated by the BBC and the government, because they specifically state that any death within 30 days after testing positive for the virus is counted as corona. So even if they die from a heart attack, or from cancer, or from a car crash within 30 days, it's counted as Covid. Therefore, I don't really want to try and guess how many of these 300 to 1,000 deaths were actually from Covid, but if we follow the general guidance of somewhere between 1 and 3%, then it turns out to be somewhere between 40 and 180 deaths a day. This is further supported by this article published by the government here, which basically states that they always planned to review the way that they were counting the deaths of Covid. They knew that they were trying to overestimate the deaths instead of underestimate, and they did plan to, try and figure out a better way of counting these deaths. But I've also seen a number of comments on social media from friends and colleagues that have had incorrect diagnosis put on death certificates. One colleague actually had a family member pass away from cancer that hadn't even tested positive for the virus, but it was put on their death certificate for administrative ease. So it seems that a lot of hospitals are putting Covid on death certificates for administrative ease, which is obviously going to further inflate those figures even higher. That colleague was also told that if they wanted to dispute the diagnosis, that they'd have to have a full post-mortem and toxicology report performed at a cost and a significant wait time. Post-August, now that the government have made this change to the way that they count the deaths, we can see that the number of deaths have reduced significantly. We actually reached an all-time high of cases per day, around 7,000 cases, but only 34 deaths. So we can see that they've reduced drastically, and now the death rate only seems to be around 0.5% as opposed to 10% or as opposed to that 1 to 3% generally accepted guidance. But how does the US compare? Well, back in April to May time, the daily infection numbers were somewhere around 25 to 35,000 a day. The daily deaths were somewhere around 800 to 2,700 a day, which gives a death rate of around 0.5%, which echoes that of the UK. But interestingly, if we look towards September, we can actually see that the daily infections have risen to 31,000 to 51,000 a day. But the daily deaths have actually fallen significantly to between 200 and 1,100 a day, which only gives a death rate of around 0.2%, which really isn't that big at all. But how does that compare to some of the other illnesses? Well, this article here suggests that around 17,000 people a year die in the UK from the seasonal flu, which is actually around 46 people every single day. So interestingly, it means that right now, more people in the UK die from the flu compared to Covid. But I suppose the risk with Covid is that it could spread faster and faster, and therefore the number of daily deaths could end up increasing. And it suggests that US deaths from the flu are somewhere between 12,000 and 61,000 a year, suggesting a death rate of somewhere between 0.1% and 0.2%. Now, interestingly, bearing in mind this is with vaccines and antiviral medication for the flu as well. So even though that the death rate is slightly below that of Covid, if there was no vaccine for the flu, then it's likely that the death rate would be much higher. If you're enjoying the video so far, then be sure to drop a like down below and subscribe to the channel. Only about 14% of you are actually subscribed to the channel, which is really low. So subscribe, it's free and you can always unsubscribe later if you so wish. Now, while I was researching, I actually found something that's really interesting, which is that COVID is very similar to a previous disease called SARS. They're both respiratory illnesses, they both originated in the same way from bats, and they're both a form of coronavirus. But interestingly, SARS is much more deadly, with a death rate of around 12%. They also have very similar R0 numbers, which basically means that they spread just as fast as each other. But interestingly, only around 8,000 people caught the SARS disease back in 2003 and 2004. Now obviously I'm not a scientist, I'm just a bloke that makes videos on the internet, so I don't really know the differences between the two. But I just found it really interesting that a previous, more deadly version of the coronavirus didn't spread nearly as much. It's also interesting that even though SARS was more dangerous and the flu spreads just as much and kills just as many people in the UK and the US, that we don't have a lockdown every year for the flu, and we didn't do a lockdown for SARS, and we also haven't done lockdowns previously before in history. But I'll talk about that later. I also think it's really important to look at the mental health side effects of a lockdown. In 2019 in the UK there were around 5,500 deaths from suicide. In the US there were around 50,000 deaths in 2019. And in 2020 this figure is expected to double as a result of lockdowns and rising unemployment. Now obviously while this is significant, it's worth noting that around 40,000 people in the UK have died from COVID and around 200,000 people in the US have also died from COVID. So obviously while doubling suicides is never a great thing, it does kind of get outweighed a bit by COVID. Now, during the Spanish flu of 1918, which killed around 50 million people worldwide, there was no worldwide lockdown. However, experts in medicine and scientists did suggest that lockdown would be a good idea, but that idea was buried by the government because obviously it would impact the war efforts, which wouldn't have been good. Therefore, it could be suggested that government are trying to learn from their mistakes of 1918 by locking down and staying safe to preserve lives. So while it does seem that COVID is a little bit more dangerous than the common cold or a sick bug, it's certainly not as dangerous as the Spanish flu or the Black Plague. So I guess the government have kind of had to try and draw the line somewhere and say, is it dangerous enough for a lockdown or is it not? If you've made it this far into the video, be sure to comment the words hidden agenda so that I know that you've made it this far into the video. So why might the governments have decided on a lockdown? Obviously, saving lives is a good thing. And even though the common cold currently kills more people in the world than COVID, COVID could spread much faster. There are currently around 7,000 cases a day in the UK and somewhere between 30 and 50,000 cases a day in the US. If the government don't intervene, this number could rise to 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 a day in the UK, or 80,000, 100,000 or 120,000 a day in the US. Now there's no actual backup to show how fast COVID would spread, but we can see previously that COVID did spread pretty fast back in April and May, and also is spreading quite fast at the moment. One theory I have is that if the current government in the UK and the US didn't intervene, then it would be political suicide. If they just did nothing and let people go on as they were and millions of people around the world passed away, people would hate them for it because they didn't do anything. If the governments did nothing, then people wouldn't vote for them at the next election. And even though it sucks to see the economy tank and then rise back up again and then potentially tank again, and house prices and everything else like that, at the end of the day, lives are probably still more important. You could say, oh, not that many people are dying, I'd rather there be no lockdown and the economy stay strong. But at the end of the day, I'm sure if you knew anyone personally, like anyone in your immediate family that had passed from COVID, you probably wouldn't be saying that. Therefore, the current government obviously want to be seen as making proactive choices, such as introducing social distancing or limiting social interaction or closing places of work, because on a political standpoint, that's the thing to do because it will make people vote for you, even though it's at a huge cost to the economy. Was it necessary? Would the entire human race go extinct if COVID was left to thrive and spread? Probably not. If you compare COVID to the death rates of Ebola or MERS or smallpox or SARS, COVID has a much lower death rate, around 0.5%. Now there's also many theories about wealth redistribution or a cashless society or tracker vaccines or how gold and silver and cryptocurrency will be the new form of money because the USD and the GBP will become worthless, or how COVID has been created by the government or the New World Order and doesn't really exist, and about depopulation plans. Now, I don't really know what to think of these theories, so let me know what you think down in the comments below. Do you think they're conspiracy theories, or do you think these theories hold a large weight of truth? And as always guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out some of my others. Alternatively, subscribe to the channel and ding the notification bell, because that way you'll be alerted when I upload a new video. Cheers!